Thank you. Thank you so much, Carolina. And thanks everyone for being here. I know that the final weeks of the term are not easy, so I really appreciate your presence. I should start by clarifying that this is very much a work in progress, as I'm currently trying to make sense of my own thoughts. So I'm really curious to hear your opinions, your feedback, if you think this makes sense, if there's anything I'm missing. So more than an argument, I'm thinking of this presentation as a sort of a pitch of my ongoing ideas and thoughts on this broader topic that I'm calling the platformization of moods and vibes. So that means that I don't have any substantial conclusions, but I do have several questions which hopefully are useful for us to think together about the new dynamics and modalities of socialization in and through digital platforms. So the initial spark about this topic emerged actually during the final stages of my PhD. As Carolina was saying, I did my PhD at the LSE. I finished it last year. And my PhD was focused on the new dimensions and manifestations of the historical concept of liveness in the social media environment. But liveness, I mean the experience of feeling or being live through technologies. So in the thesis and the subsequent publications that came from it, I explored the ambivalent relationships that people establish with those technologies, especially with what we call social media, broadly defined. So I discussed things such as the experiences of scrolling endless social media feeds, the ambivalent temporalities that emerge with and through algorithmic mediation. And in this context, liveness was described by my interviewees as a feeling or an atmosphere that emerges from these now ubiquitous infrastructures. And I also noticed that many of my interviewees, they use terms such as moods or vibes to describe the mundane or aimless attachments they have with digital platforms and to refer to the particular ambiances of each different app. At the same time, the participants of my project, they also described most of their experiences with social media as passive, as aimless, and that's marked by a state of absent-mindedness. So constructions such as mindless scrolling were very common in the interviews and diaries that I collected with people who live in London and use a range of social media in everyday life. I argue that mindlessness and absent-mindedness, or whatever you want to call those experiences, they are premised on the separation between body and mind, in which the body is supposed to be engaged compulsively, addictively, scrolling and swiping frantically, while the mind is taken to be empty, void, and passive. So on the one hand, I see this as reproducing long-standing Cartesian dualisms, right? And on the other hand, I also think this is preventing us from exploring those dynamics in more depth, which is partially what I'm trying to do in this presentation. I argue that we could describe this mindlessness as what Patty Scannell described as the experience of no experience. And I say this because, according to my participants, nowadays social media is less about establishing connections or sharing about their everyday life. It is much more about a sensorial stimulation. It is just about keeping the content flowing and getting in the zone. So my analysis suggested that social media use in its idleness, banality, ordinariness is generally considered by my participants as dispossessed of any existential significance. As I was finishing my PhD, I also encountered opinion pieces discussing the imminent end of social media as we know it. So I have some examples here. Vice announced that social media is dead. The Atlantic argued that the age of social media is ending. Forbes asked whether this is the downfall of social media as we know it. And The Verge argued that social media is doomed to die. I wonder to what extent that's true and whether in the past few years you haven't used any social media at all. What I think that these apocalyptic pieces suggest is that there has been a fundamental shift or change in digital sociality in which the values for which we once celebrated those technologies, such as connection, sharing, and so on, are being replaced by a broadcast model based precisely on the passive consumption that was described by my interviewees. Vice's article, in particular, argued that the platforms that came to define social media as we came to know it over the last decade are largely being replaced by other platforms and their own models of online interaction. So some of the questions that I started to ask myself were, what exactly are these new modes of online interaction that represent the so-called end of social media as we know it? What does it mean for our understanding of digital sociality? Or better, where is sociality even located within this new media landscape? How can we possibly approach this as an object of inquiry without essentializing certain practices or experiences as inherently passive? So those are big questions, and I'll try to address some of them in this talk. Engaging with those debates, in this presentation, I'm trying to offer an overview of what I'm calling the platformization of moods and vibes. So just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about and how it relates to everything that I just said, I have selected two very popular examples that I assume most of you are familiar with, which are TikTok and Spotify. So TikTok's self-claimed mission is to inspire creativity and bring joy. As you probably know, the most known attribute of the platform is its capacity to draw in users' attention for extended periods in which this supposedly omniscient algorithm keeps you hooked in for much longer than you had originally anticipated when you open the app just to have a browse. So this thoughtless hypnotism, as described by Taika, becomes the perfect environment for the seeking of affective sparks that provide mild but instant gratification. So while this is to some extent also applicable to other platforms, I think what is interesting is that TikTok almost has no pledge over friends or contacts, and indeed privileges your own resonance with the content. Also, among the wide variety of genres uploaded every single day, a lot of TikTok's content is meant for sensorial appreciation more than for anything else. And I'm talking here about things such as ASMR, mukbang, satisfying sand-cutting videos, and things like that. So there's a playfulness in these materials in which the sensory perception, enjoyment, and pleasure are favored over interpretation, connection, or even sociality. Likewise, I think the audiovisually oriented character of the platform, as well as the incentive for the incorporation of repetition and for recognizable sounds, are said to contribute to the creation of certain vibes. And while other platforms such as Pinterest and Tumblr were already permeated by mood boards and hashtag aesthetics, emblematic of different cultural scenes, such as cottagecore, emocore, Barbiecore, to speak of one more recent one, on TikTok, the idea that what matters is just feeling and sharing a vibe is not only intensified, but also datafied, personalized, and algorithmified. Now for the second example. In what is now part of the end-of-year list tradition, Spotify Wrapped is a summary of each user's yearly listening habits. I assume most of you know what I'm talking about, and maybe you're already anticipating what your Spotify Wrapped is going to look like this year. So while some categories such as most listened artist and most listened song have been figuring on those lists from the beginning, in 2021 there was the introduction of a new category, the audio aura. So Spotify paired with esoteric coach Mystic Michaela to identify patterns of behavior from users' data, organizing those according to 6 mood descriptors. So they make use of new age jargon to create personalized badges made up of 2 audio moods that best represent each of us' listening habits. Through this, I found out, for instance, that my audio aura is a mix of the moods kindness and focused, whatever that means. And although the whole combination of the mystical with the algorithmic is in itself already interesting, I am more intrigued by the appropriation of atmospheric states such as moods and vibes into platform rhetoric. Although Spotify is more of a streaming service than social media or a social medium, strictly speaking, I think initiatives such as Wrapped have a clear component of sociability, not only because they are based on harvestings of user behavioral data, but also because they are created to be shared on platforms such as Instagram. So I think increasingly music streaming platforms such as Spotify rely on the one hand, what Luke Starr called techniques of emotional profiling, and on the other hand, on what Pelly called mood tailor recommendations. In so doing, Spotify has been focusing its communication on the emotional journeys of music consumption, claiming to offer music for every mood. So what I hope these 2 examples illustrate is this alleged shift towards the datafication, algorithmization, and platformization of ephemeral, ethereal states of being. And although the use of media for the creation and maintenance of ambiances and atmospheres is not necessarily new, I think there is something peculiar about this current phenomenon and that it deserves theoretical and empirical efforts, especially because it might be a productive entry point to unpack these alleged new models of sociality without reproducing the problematic notion of passivity that I was mentioning at the beginning. Mostly, I think this calls for more attention to the embodied experience itself, to the emotional, sensual, visceral, existential dimensions of our engagements with digital technologies, for purposes beyond socialization. Atmospheres, they are somewhat indeterminate, they are impossible to capture, and they are difficult to attribute to either the subject who are experiencing it or to the environment in which it's situated. So the notions of aura, moods, vibes seem to me to be at the threshold between the affective and the infrastructural, which is why I am trying to propose a critical phenomenological perspective to make sense of this alleged term. And I'll clarify what I mean by that in a second. I'm sure you've encountered the rhetoric of vibes, especially of good vibes only, in interior decor, in fashion, and increasingly in other industries such as tourism, as the examples from Jet2 and Air Transat show here. Also, and although the management of feelings, emotions, and affects has long been part of the culture and creative industries, I think we can agree that there is a popularization of the incorporation of the vernacular of the vibe into different realms. When it comes to digital platforms, as I was saying, vibes and moods appear as part of the personalization opportunities afforded by those technologies, as in the case of Spotify Wrapped, as I said before, as tools for the user to modulate their own experience, in the case of playlists, as a way of reflecting and performing your inner state of being, as exemplified by Instagram, which prompts users to find their vibe. Here's in Portuguese, but what they're saying is choose a filter and find your vibe. And to craft your digital identities, as in Lemon 8, which I think is very small here, but it says, add a profile photo and name to blend in your vibes. Another interesting example that is somewhat more recent is the case of Threads. I don't know how many of you created a Threads account and how many of you are still using Threads. I assume not many. But in any case, I thought it was interesting that in launching their competitor for Twitter/X, Meta was trying to convey their vision for Threads, and Mark Zuckerberg defended an environment with no hard news, no politics, and no negativity. So a critical eye could say that this is targeted to stakeholders, such as investors and advertisers, probably as a reaction to the whole Cambridge Analytica debacle and the damage it has done to Facebook's reputation. But we could also say that this is a form of platform hygiene, in which certain topics are avoided or suppressed so that the app becomes as brand-friendly as possible. As also conveniently summarized by Instagram CEO Adam Mosseri on the picture on your right, Threads is for good vibes only. In practice, this would require significant moderation efforts. It would also mean the internalization and self-monitoring of policing of toxic vibes by the users themselves, which means modulating their own moods and feelings according to platforms' guidelines. So hopefully all of those examples help to illustrate the pervasiveness of the notion of vibes, moods, and feelings in different realms of everyday life, and the incorporation and appropriation of these discourses by mainstream digital platforms. So how can we make sense of moods and vibes and this broader shift toward the platformization of states of being? Moods have historically been a topic of interest to phenomenology and to the study of our being in the world. Likewise, mood regulation has long been a function of media. And music, in particular, has long been examined for its capacity to allow us to tune in and tune out and to modulate our emotions, our affects, and experiences. Under this scope, the body is taken as a dynamic site of experience, marked by passions, feelings, and moods that are constantly in flux, and which also provide orientations in our continuous attunement to the world. So what platforms such as TikTok, Spotify, and now Threads seem to be doing is to respond to an alleged experiential demand for mood modulation, as described by Thurio, a powerful desire behind this new sense of mood to see our internal states projected in some sort of external objective form. As also argued by Paul Roquet, we have now an intensification of processes of technically mediated mood regulation, which recognize ambience not as a background component, but rather as an immersive product in and of itself. Still according to Roquet, in a context of platform capitalism, ambience presents a mood as a concretized thing, an off-the-shelf vibe consumable as a product. So I argue that it's when moods are concretized, platformized, and commodified that they become vibes. So contrary to moods, vibes are not individual. As argued by Miles, vibe is a collective communicative system used to make sense. So vibes can be understood as the collectivization of moods, even if not necessarily through conversation or intersubjectivity. Robin James, who's currently writing a full book on vibes, argues that the term vibe refers now to a new vernacular of self-awareness and perception. in which, as we interact with platforms and devices, we learn how algorithms perceive us. Vibe has been further theorized as a concept that focuses on unnamed feelings and bodily responses more than on deeply reflexive moments. It is an interpretive technique, a mode of sense-making that rejects rationalistic epistemologies by emphasizing the affective and the merely felt. As most of you know, and as Carolina rightly introduced at the beginning of this talk, there is a big portion of scholarship now focused on the affective dimensions of our relations with and through digital technologies. So I'm trying to dialogue with these works and propose that more attention should be dedicated to the fluid, ethereal, and frail matter of states of being. Practices of mood regulation, they are often associated with therapy culture and with broader demands for reflexivity, self-care, and emotional control. Cultural theorist Ben Highmore argues that mood is worked and maintained through degrees of labor that is at once our labor and also delegated to objects and environments. So in a contemporary mediascape, part of the lure seems to be to delegate this work of regulation and modulation to digital platforms themselves. Also crucial to this notion of the platformization of states of being, and as I'm trying to theorize, is that the association of mood modulation and capitalism is a profound one, as much of our mood-regulating media is geared towards enhancing productivity. But perhaps there's more there than in those practices of mood regulation than ensuring docility and productivity. Indeed, I think an interest in the ephemeral states of being should be marked by what Tim Markin called ambivalent curiosity, which takes the boring, the aimless, the banal, and the merely felt as legitimate objects of analysis. So in short, I think that a critical phenomenological framework could be productive epistemologically, theoretically, and even methodologically for scrutinizing social media at the intersection of affect and the political economy of platformization. In so doing, I take moods, vibes, and their mediation to be at one time foundational to embody experience, but also deeply embedded in broader social, technical, and material practices. Like emotions, I argue that moods and vibes should not be regarded only as internal or psychological states. They are also cultural and social practices. And I think we must engage with a discussion on how, through processes of datafication, personalization, standardization, and algorithmization, bodily states such as moods become practices that can be managed through digital media once those technologies become central to our regimes of sensory calibration. So calibrating our bodies to the atmospheres and environments where we are located. So such a phenomenon, I think, requires more than attention to ambiances and atmospheres as naturally occurring. It demands a focus on their production and on their orchestration. So I've been trying to defend here a critical phenomenological approach. And perhaps this is not entirely clear to many of you here. You might be asking, what the hell do you mean by that? And hopefully, those questions will be answered now. So I argue that the interest in moods and vibes, or in this platformization of states of being, is ultimately an interest in theories of perception and their technical mediation. So, as described by Ben Highmore, how the world feels to us is the object of phenomenological thinking. So by critical phenomenology, I mean a phenomenological disposition that is not blind to the social, technical, and political environment in which it's situated. By phenomenology, then, I mean an interest in the experience as it's felt by situated subjects. Also, I argue that in order to theorize our contemporary digital sociality, we must incorporate what Don Eade said back in the 90s, in that technologies, they can be both the means to an experience, but also an object of experience in and of themselves. So there are, in these messy, complex, and quasi-indiscernible ways, the experience of the technology itself, that is, the relation between your embodied self and the screen, the always updating feed of content, the non-stopping notification pop-ups, but also the experiences one has access to through digital media. The examination of this phenomenon might require focusing our attention from issues of authenticity, identity, etc., to issues of pleasure, comfort, satisfaction, and joy, and the lack thereof. It also demands the use of methods that allow us to acknowledge the very existence and significance of those mixed feelings and of their entanglement with a corporate technoscape, and with the very difficulty in naming, capturing, and defining those sensations and impressions. As I said, I don't really have any substantial conclusions at this stage, but I do have questions. I think perhaps this so-called social media as we know it now means that music sociologist Tia Denora was right, and that when it comes to contemporary mediated sociality, rather than intersubjectivity based on dialogue and conversation, we have the rise of co-subjectivity, in which the strategic use of media allows other people to contribute to a shared energy and collective orientation without ever demanding foreground attention themselves. In this sense, I argue that digital media can become vibescaping or moodscaping devices. My suggestion is that paying attention to moods and vibes can be useful for us to examine precisely those experiences that tend to be framed as having no existential significance, the experience of no experience, as I said before. So ultimately, I am interested in examining experiences at the surface level. That is, I'm interested in focusing on the existential dimensions of media from the superficial, that which is observable, sensible, rather than privileging any deeper feelings. So moods and vibes as categories, they prime for the examination of affect in a low key, or, as Caroline Padel said, in a minor tone. And for an emphasis on intensity as a propeller, but also as the outcome of media use. From this lens, perhaps then, rather than the experience of no experience, what the platformization of moods and vibes means is that social media are increasingly about the experience of feeling itself. So some of the questions that I hope to pursue in the future are, where are moods and vibes located? In the individual, in the environment, or are we better off without reproducing these dichotomies? Can we describe particular forms of digital mediation as moodful, even if mindless? If moods and vibes are active, how are they made in the context of platformization? And what is the labor involved in these practices of mood regulation? To what extent are canon concepts such as aura or structure of feeling appropriate and or sufficient to capture this phenomenon? What happens to individuals when bodily states become practices that can be managed through digital platforms? And what happens to society once those technologies become central to contemporary regimes of sensory calibration? At the moment, as I warned you, I don't have answers, but I hope you enjoy the vibes. Thank you.